Good afternoon, and welcome to our 8th In Dialogue here at the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Religious and Ethnic Diversity. Today's event is co-organized with the German Federal Ministry of Education and Research funded collaborative research project QUAMAFA, short for Qualification and Skill in the Migration Process of Foreign Workers in Asia. The team consists of 5 migration scholars: Ruth Achenbach, Aimi Muranaka, Juin Justin Park, Mega Watwa, and myself, all of us here with us today. Today's discussion is inspired by our project's findings of the past 4 years. We have taken a critical look at the case of highly skilled migration in the most populous migration region in the world, Asia. The need to recruit highly skilled migrants from abroad, however, is not limited to Asia, but is a major endeavor of aging societies around the world, including Germany. What is also common to both Asian and European receiving countries is the rhetoric of highly skilled migrants as unproblematic movers and a focus on their economic contributions to the receiving countries. These migrants' daily lives, their interaction with the host society, and household decisions are often ignored. As such, we have studied highly skilled migrants' attraction, retention, and incorporation in 3 of Asia's major migrant-receiving countries, which are Japan, South Korea, and Singapore. Next to academic publications, which are already out or forthcoming, the project has also produced a documentary, Home in the Making, and those on-site here today will later have the opportunity to watch it. As another important outcome of our project, we are delighted to enter into dialogue with 4 experts of the field and discuss some of the crucial questions of skilled migration in a comparative perspective. While highly skilled migrants are often assumed not to be interested in staying in their destination countries long-term or to easily relocate elsewhere, our research has demonstrated that many migrants end up staying longer than expected, and that their mobility and staying decisions are shaped by a complex set of factors. Germany, like the 3 examined Asian countries, has made substantial efforts to attract and retain highly skilled migrants to fill their labor market needs. We are now looking forward to discussing the economic, social, and political implications of receiving, retaining, and incorporating highly skilled migrants. We will also consider the tensions emerging between the different stakeholders in this process, including the receiving society, policymakers, firms, and the migrants themselves. So let me introduce our 4 panelists. First, I would like to welcome Professor Dr. Anja Weiss, who has participated in one of our Institute's previous In Dialogue events as well, and who has been an advisor to the QUAMAFA project, as she has attended the project Status Symposium 2 years ago, together with Steve Vertowek, the founder and director of this institute. Anja is professor for macro-sociology and transnational processes at the Institute for Sociology at the University of Duisburg-Essen. Her theoretical interests in global and transnational inequalities translate into comparative empirical studies on highly skilled migrants, the globalization of professional knowledge, institutional racism and legal exclusion, anti-racism, and transnational qualitative research design. Her major publications include a study on high-skilled migrants' trajectories into labor markets in Germany, Turkey, and Canada, with Noel Schittenhelm and Schmidtke in Work in Transition. She also serves on the board of the Interdisciplinary Center for Integration and Migration at the University of Duisburg-Essen. Next, I am very pleased to welcome Dr. Chang Lee, who is one of the leading experts of skilled migration in South Korea and a research fellow at the Migration Research and Training Center, short MRTC, a government-funded institute dedicated to immigration policy research in South Korea. Chang completed his PhD in sociology at the University of Maryland, where his dissertation used Korean migration to the United States as a case study to reveal how global perspectives can reshape traditional views of stratification and social mobility, often constrained by nation-based frameworks. His areas of expertise include labor migration, skilled migration, immigration policy, and the Korean diaspora. Since joining the Migration Research and Training Center in 2013, he has led numerous projects, including recent studies on Korea's population decline and its impact on immigration policy, foreign researchers in Korea, employment pathways for STEM international students, immigration policy and human capital citizenship, and social mobility among Korean immigrants in Australia. Currently, he is focusing on the evolving policies and landscape of international students in Korea. Moving on to the next panelist, I would like to welcome Gracia Liu-Farrer, who is Professor of Sociology at the Graduate School of Asia-Pacific Studies and Director of the Institute of Asian Migration at Waseda University in Japan. Gracia has been a long-term advisor of our work and a host for several of us during our field research in Japan. Her research examines immigration into Japan, transnational labor and student mobilities in East Asia, as well as between Asia and Europe. She hopes to bring Asian experiences to migration and mobility theorization. Her recent books include The Handbook of Asian Migrations with Brenda Yo, Immigrant Japan, Mobility and Belonging in an Ethno-Nationalist Society, Tangled Mobilities, Places, Affects and Personhood Across Social Spheres in Asian Migration, and The Question of Skill in Cross-Border Labor Mobilities with Brenda Yo and Michael Bass. She has published journal articles and book chapters on migrants ranging from Chinese students, Nepali restaurant workers to Syrian refugees. Very diverse. And last but not least, I am very happy to welcome back Junjia, who is Associate Professor in Geography at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. Jia is an alumni of this institute, and like Anja, she's participating in an In Dialogue event the second time already, so everyone knows. Her research and teaching interests lie at the intersections of migration studies, urban diversification, and the political economic development of Southeast Asia. Her current project investigates how migrant creative labor is made precarious through the skill optic. Her work has been published in Progress in Human Geography, Antipode, Transactions of the Institute of British Geographers, Annals of the American Association of Geographers, and Environment and Planning D, Society and Space. Her first monograph, Class Inequality in the Global City, Migrants, Workers, and Cosmopolitanism in Singapore, won Labor History's annual book prize. My name is Helena Hoff, and I'm a research fellow here at the Institute, as well as a senior research and teaching fellow at the University of Zurich. I'm also a member of QAMAFA and look forward to moderating today's discussion. Finally, a note on the format. We will first discuss the different insights from the 4 countries, and will then reserve 30 minutes at the end for questions from the floor. For those joining us online today, please type your questions in the chat, which you can either do via YouTube if you have registered there, or you can use the Institute chat address to drop an email. It is displayed on the online screen. My colleague from the Institute, Elisa Lanari, will read the questions out later on so that you will be heard. I now want to start the discussion with the perhaps controversial question you might have been wondering about already. Speaking about highly skilled migrants, who are these highly skilled migrants in your country? Gia, would you like to start and talk about the case of Singapore?
Sure, thanks. So the category of skilled migrants in Singapore, like in many other places, is a very broad one, right? In Singapore, highly skilled migrants mainly comprise of the PMTs, professionals, managers, technical employees, with highly specialized skills. While there are top positions in multinational corporations, most skilled migrants are within this large PMT group. And many of them work as engineers, doctors, creative workers, advertisers, people doing post-production work in the media, researchers, academics, and middle-level managers. Of this large group of skilled workers, the source countries are diverse. They come from pretty much anywhere around the world, making it quite different from the composition of people who are classified as low-income migrant workers.
Thank you so much for first insight. Who would like to continue? Maybe Chang?
Okay. It's a very actually tough question, right? The skill is a socially constructed concept, so that the meaning of a highly skilled can be different by society. Then who are highly skilled migrants in Korea? So I think it would be good to look at how the Korean visa system categorizes the highly skilled migrants. Generally, the Korean visa system separates employment visa into one for professional workers and the other for the unskilled workers. Then the professional workers include university professors, like you said, researchers, foreign language teachers, and lawyers, doctors, accountants, and managers and specialists in IT industry. But one thing I want to highlight is the definition of a skilled migrant in Korea is expanding. Yeah. Korea now considers international students as more than just temporary residents. They consider the international students as potential highly skilled migrants who can work and settle in Korea after their studies. It is interesting because in Korea, 70% of young adults aged 25 to 34 have a university degree, the highest among OECD countries. So in Korea, just having a university degree does not mean someone is highly skilled. However, for migrants, if they acquire a university degree from Korea, the government regards them as a potential highly skilled migrants. Another thing is the government started to regard the unskilled workers also as they categorize as skilled workers if they accumulate their job experience in the workplace. And if someone who go to the local area or depopulated area and get a job there, then government also start calling them as a local talent. So it shows that the definition of a highly skilled is changing. Actually, the context of this is the shrinking population in Korea. So if the foreign or migrants fill the gaps and the labor shortage or population shortage, government try to embrace them as maybe labor and population. And in order to persuade the Korean nationals, those peoples are really skilled, so that's why they are expanding the definition of highly skilled. Yeah.
Thank you. How does it look like in Japan, Gracia?
I was actually thinking about this when I got the question, who are the highly skilled? So who are the highly skilled? And I think that the label highly skilled is used most often probably by researchers in the context of Japan. Because in Japan, I think the only occasion, or the legal occasion that uses the legal category only emerged in 2012 for this visa category called highly skilled professional, which is the English translation, which is not Japanese, right? So otherwise, in Japan, I think people usually use the label human resources, 经济, literally human resources, or talent, to describe those people that are desirable labor force for Japan. And so there isn't this really kind of high or low skilled kind of hierarchy in the Japanese context. I think this highly skilled professional is a very specific application. But I think somehow, myself included, a lot of researchers just flexibly use the label highly skilled to describe whoever they are studying, and the people who graduate from universities or people who have specific credentials. And sometimes I question that, am I irresponsible in applying this label highly skilled for my subjects? And as I have argued before, because this is really arbitrary, who are highly skilled, who are not. So I think, and yes, simply put, in Japan, people usually use the label human resources, which I don't like, but and I think it's equivalent to like highly skilled.
Which was a specific take also on the people. I guess we will discuss it further, but let's first hear from Anja about the case of Germany.
I think it's an interesting debate whether we want to stay with visa categories or labor market demand. And as a sociologist, I have opted for using the academic degree as an indicator. And if you do that, the situation in Germany is actually very interesting, because most of the migrants holding university degrees are not in the visa categories for high-skilled migrants. Because like if we look at the blue card that targets high-skilled and labor market desirable migrants, we have something like 190,000. But when we look at refugees and the rates of university degrees amongst them, Ukrainian refugees have 72% university degrees, and it's about 1 million people, so it's 700,000 university graduates. Same thing with Syrians, they have 13% university degree, so even that brings the number up to 150,000 people who have a university degree. And most of the time they are not working according to their education. But in Germany, having a university degree still is quite a big achievement, because we have other kinds of vocational training that are also in high demand. So it is an interesting question. What happens to all those highly skilled migrants who are not in the highly skilled visa categories?
May I respond
Sure.
to what some people have said?
Go ahead.
Thank you very much for your points. I think just picking up off of some of what you've said, Chang, when you said that skill is socially constructed, right? And I couldn't agree more. But I think also, based on what people have said, clearly skill also holds deeply political implications, right? In terms of what this label enables and what it prevents, right? In the Singaporean context, people who are on the employment pass. So these are people who earn above a certain income level, and we can talk about that later. They earn above a certain income level. They have very different privileges than people who are labeled as semi-skilled or unskilled, right? And in Singapore, like in many other places, skill corresponds to these categories, at least, they correspond to income levels, right? So if you're on the employment pass, you are allowed to bring your family, you can bring your dependents. In theory, you have access to longer term residency. Yeah. So skill is socially constructed, right? Which means that what counts as skill also changes over time, right? But I think skill also holds these, profoundly political implications on what kind of lives people can have.
I totally agree, because the reason why Japanese government created this highly skilled professionals, they just want to carve out a specific segment of migrant population as particularly desirable to be sought after, and giving them all the privileges. So I think, but then other skilled categories are permissible, basically, right? But it's a highly skilled, as in the Japanese context, it's just very privileged group, and also small. And you have to accrue to about 70 points, and above 70 points, you have all the privileges. But it's really about ranking people.
Yeah. It becomes a kind of stratification, right?
Yeah, I totally agree. The highly skilled is a kind of political term because, as I said, the Korean government, as I think, using the highly skilled term for those who are unskilled workers is kind of in order to justify and for the government also consider the Korean people's the sentiment against the low skilled workers, so that they use that term, highly skilled, even they thought they are thinking they are not quite highly skilled. It's a very political term, yes.
So I started out with this as a easy question, but as we see, it's extremely complex, and we're touching on politics already, which then leads to my next question. We have seen states want certain people maybe more than others, and there is a lot of thinking and rationale behind who and how do we want, how do we attract them. So what do you then see as the biggest challenge for attracting and also for retaining highly skilled migrants in each of the countries that you study? And here, maybe Anja, would you like to start?
Well, one challenge is exactly this political desire to adjust constantly to what might be the desirable groups of migrants. And so, like in Germany, we already have a very complex foreigner and visa law, and it gets complex every few months, more complex every few months. And for high-skilled migrants, that creates extra frustration because they usually, being educated, expect things to work in a rational manner. And then they are confronted with administrations that sometimes do not understand the complexity that lawmakers create all the time. And it's now common knowledge in Germany that this part of the administration is the most complex part of the administration, which is also why it's hard to get people even to work in that field. The other issue is, of course, racism, public discourse, anti-foreigner. Now, high-skilled migrants, in my experience, on the one hand, try to distance themselves from the other unwanted migrants. But on the other hand, they can't fail to see that they are also targets of hostility. And especially in the long run, when you think about where your children will grow up, that certainly is also an issue.
Yeah. Administrative part, racism. I'm sure this will come up in the other stories as well. So how about Singapore? Yeah.
I think in Singapore, which has had a very long history of inward migration, indeed, in many ways, Singapore is a child of migration. Yeah. Within that context, there is nevertheless the very complicated challenge of balancing national economic aspirations, wanting to stay a key player within the global economy while maintaining social cohesion in Singapore, right? And I think it is a challenge because, as we know, migration processes do not exist in a vacuum, right? They are very much also related to other social dynamics as well. Migration will only grow more important and more diverse in Singapore that is seeing an aging population along with a very, very low birth rate. I think we're only second to Korea. In Singapore, there's a bit of a joke that every 12 years, there can be a slight bump in the birth rate because it's the dragon year. And for a lot of Chinese Singaporeans, it's a very auspicious year to have children. But our birth rate is so low that I don't think the dragon can save us. Yeah, so keeping this in mind, right, there is the need to, I think, fortify the labor force through inward migration. But at the same time, there is also the persistent challenge of maintaining or managing the sort of local groundswell in Singapore. Yeah.
And the Singaporean government here has a fine line to walk, as far as I know, because of the social cohesion having become really an issue, a lot of tension with lots of immigration, highly skilled immigration also in the 2000s. So I'm wondering how they are trying to, from your perspective, how they are trying to still keep attracting these people.
Yeah. I think that retaining is I feel an even bigger challenge than attracting, right? Because in my work, I see a lot of attrition of people who are classified as skilled migrants, yeah? And I think this attrition rate is in part, and this will, I think, overlap some of the questions that we'll discuss later, but I think this attrition rate has a lot to do with changing labor and migration policies, right? That are constantly changing, yeah? And people respond, like migrants have to respond to that, right? But I think a big turning point in Singapore when it comes to retaining highly skilled migrants would be in 2011 during the election when a lot of Singaporeans were very unhappy with the number of migrants who are coming in, and to sort of manage that, the Singaporean state they made changes to immigration policy so that it became much more restrictive for highly skilled migrants, not so much people who are on the lower income end of the spectrum.
Yeah, so this is very interesting. Now we're really talking about the difficulties of actually attracting and retaining the highly skilled. And this is a very different context than from Korea and Japan, which do not have this long history. So how do you see these challenges?
Yeah, in South Korea, actually, there are a lot of challenges for attracting and retaining highly skilled migrants, maybe non-English speaking countries, societies, and maybe the very top working environment, you know, the 9 to 6, yeah, and also maybe the educational environment for their children. They are all played, I think, made in negative ways. But as a policy researcher, I want to point out the policy issues in terms of the attracting or retaining the highly skilled migrants. I think it's too hard to get permanent residence in Korea. Actually, the highly skilled migrants are able to stay long term without permanent residence, as long as having their professional employment visa. But problem is, while they can work under a professional visa, but it must be renewed every 2 or 3 years. To renew it, they must remain employed and meet certain wage conditions. If they lose their jobs or they cannot find another job with the same level of salary, they may have to leave the country. So if they want to stay long term, and also if they want to invest their life or they invest on their development, they have to have the permanent residence. But the Korean government requires that migrants who want to apply permanent residence must prove that their income is twice the previous year's gross national income, which means, for example, in 2023, last year, GNI of Korea is about 29,000 euros, so that highly skilled migrants need an income of around 58,000 euros. However, I don't know, I can make it, I don't know. But, however, even for the highly skilled migrants, just only few migrants actually earn this amount of or higher. So because of such the high income requirement, many highly skilled migrants, especially younger ones, they feel that permanent residence is out of reach. So this uncertainty makes them nervous about staying in Korea long term. Yeah, that's the biggest problem, I think.
That's interesting because I think in Japan it's quite different, and it's almost like the other way around. Because I think Japan might not be so attractive because people don't think of it as a destination for immigration. It's an unfamiliarity with the notion that Japan could be a place to develop your career, right? So people always think of Japan as a cultural destination, as a tourist destination, good food. But working there is just not something that comes to their mind. And also because the Japanese language is not something that most people study as the first foreign language. So thinking that is kind of mysterious, culturally interesting place, but probably not for career development. So I think in that sense, people who like to come to Japan are, is a specific group of people, are culturally more interested. I think, Helena, your own research also mentioned that before. But oftentimes when people come to Japan, they find a very different kind of scenario, and policy-wise, it's actually much easier to stay and much easier to enter the job market. It's much more accessible than a lot of people imagine. And there are a lot of barriers and hurdles. But in terms of retention, so far in research, the biggest problem probably is the kind of Japanese way of organizing careers, the kind of way the employment system works. And the promotion takes, on average, 15 years. And a lot of migrants don't think they want to work in the same position for 15 years so that they could advance to a leadership somewhere. But that's the norm in Japanese firms. And so that's sort of, in a sense, a very domestically oriented labor market employment system, and the kind of a global mobility of talent and that sort of career aspirations just don't match. So I think that's probably the biggest problem in Japan for retaining some of the migrants, the professional migrants or employees. But the policy-wise, it's actually increasing, like even permanent residency, etc., has become increasingly relaxed.
There's a lot we will discuss on, but Anja seems to have a direct comment.
Yeah, it's interesting because that connects with the development in Germany, because the ease of naturalization has increased significantly for basically anyone holding a steady job and paying insurance. And so I think for the very heterogeneous group of people that we're talking about, those who are able to secure employment, the chances of them staying are relatively high unless they are the very competitive people that are sought after worldwide. Because when they do have different options, being naturalized as a German may be just a good jumping board to move on elsewhere. So there is very likely a kind of selectivity between the people who are happy with the situation in Germany, even though it does have some disadvantages, but they have a job, they become naturalized, they settle here, and those who aim for higher career aspirations, who may just take this as a stepping stone and then move on, because there is a class ceiling when you don't know very good German, you want to go into management and that kind of stuff. But it does connect a bit with what you said, Gracia.
There's another comment.
Just responding to some of the things that have been said. I think Chang-Won's comments just made me think about how these changes indicate how citizenship is becoming more exclusive, right? I see that in Singapore also. Starting January 2025, the employment pass, the minimum salary for employment pass in Singapore will be $5,600 Singaporean dollars. So that's about, I think, 4,500 euros-ish. And this is for people who are not in the financial sector. So if you work in the financial industry, then the minimum salary is even higher, right? Because the assumption is you will be earning a higher salary if you work in a bank, for example. And I think I'm also thinking about a lot of these international students who are aspiring to work in Singapore after graduation. I can only imagine the anxiety, right? I mean, I'm sure Ruth's work talks about this also, how getting this employment pass seems increasingly out of reach, I think. But also, when Gracia was talking, I was thinking about how the retainment of skilled migrants is not just about the job, right? It's not just about whether they can have access to citizenship. It's, I think for many migrants, it's also about how, another very ambivalent word, integrated they feel socially, right? Yeah. I think in Singapore, many highly skilled migrants feel that it's a very transient place, right? People are always moving through, whether they're using it as a stepping stone or because they cannot get their visa renewed or because the rules change and suddenly they're no longer seen as highly skilled, they're just kind of skilled. So I think for many migrants, it is also an issue of not having that social support system with them, not just family, but friends also.
Yeah, it's actually something I want to pick up on because, what country are you migrating to and what would it mean then actually to stay beyond, let's say, the labor market and the visa policies if they allow you to stay? So we are talking here about quite different countries of immigration or with very different immigration histories, or if we want so, immigration countries in the making. And now here I'm specifically referring to Korea and Japan, as we've heard. So what we've now been discussing, these countries as emerging immigration countries, how does this self-identification of emerging, or maybe not yet, or maybe not wanting to talk about being an immigration country, how does this matter, in your opinion, from your findings, for skilled migrants?
Okay, I think host countries' self-identification will be strongly affect migrants, I think. But in Korea, officially, government still identifies as a non-immigrant country. But this identity is unlikely to last because there is an argument even within the government. Many government officials said we need to admit that Korea now become immigrant society. That is not avoidable, and we have to learn from the experience of Germany, because they changed from the guest worker program system to immigration country, right? So we are now very interested in the experience of Germany, how they transit. So, but why? Actually, okay. I can give a fun example. In Korea, there is a foreign policy basic plan presented by the government every 5 years since 2008. I said the official name of the plan is foreign policy, but in the inside of the book, the policy book, they said that this plan basically equals to an immigration policy plan. So why they decide that just is a foreign policy, I participated in the discussion among the government officers, And they all acknowledge that now this is an immigration policy, but if we publicly, call this is immigration policy, all Korean peoples may, what? Like, we are immigrant society? And then they're so concerned about that. So they try to hide, using foreign policy, but I think that the problem is that these hesitations influence policy. Not only just hesitation, but also this kind of attitude of hesitation to admit immigrant society affects the migrants' well-being. So now many ministries actually in conflict to some ministries we should open and we should take, but the other ministries, oh no, the Korean nationals don't like that. So it's a kind of in transition period nowadays. So maybe. So one thing that I found is marriage migrants, they are quite accepted as maybe our groups. So if we think about the marriage migrants, we are really the good immigrant society. But for other types of migrants, actually, if we think about that groups, actually many totally are still non-immigrant society. So there is some, we cannot generalize it's very complicated.
I think it's certainly Japan is quite similar and does not want to admit that it's an immigration country yet, not in the political discourse or policy discussion. It's human resources and foreign talent. So not an immigration. And I think that kind of discourse does affect how migrants themselves plan their immigration. Because when they think of going to Japan, they think of that as a temporary move, right? Because Japan has never been associated with this settling, permanent settlement kind of image. So people don't even know whether it's possible. So when they think of going to Japan, it's going to take some detour and adventure just to try out as a cultural experience and a career adventure, and then see what happens. And sometimes these people probably just like cartoon or animation very much, or games, so they come to Japan. But then a lot of them stay. That's the thing, right? Because it takes quite a bit of a cultural competency to enter that kind of society, to actually finally kind of live in that society. Once you accumulated this sort of cultural capital and the social capital, you feel that somehow you have started building your base of life, and it's not so easy to leave. So I think in Japan's case, yes, Japan's image as this not immigration country certainly creates this difficulty for people to imagine living permanently in Japan, and that factors in their objectives for moving to Japan. But many of them do stay because migration is pragmatic. And the more you do, the more baggage you accumulate. And you're stuck.
So in the end, what we find is that people do stay against all odds, you might even say. We have heard of all these.
Oh, the number one reason is marriage. I just did a quantitative study of skilled migrants. The odds of staying for people who married to a Japanese spouse is 10 times as much as those people who don't have that.
I interviewed so many professors in the university a few years ago, and I asked them, why you stay here in Korea, even you so complain a lot. I found that all of them, that their spouse are Korean.
Yeah.
Right.
I think this is something we see, right? Marriage, love has always been and probably will always be the reason. Interestingly, it doesn't need to be the citizen of that country. That's what we found in our research. So even those who are married to a third country partner, they might stay as well. And even those who are singles, they might stay. So it goes even beyond. But yes, I think it became very clear. You have invested into something. And so you're there. These people, as they are categorized, should be able to stay. The countries seem to want them. But then how do the government policies, and I think it came through with some of the answers, but maybe we can look at a little bit more critically at it now. So how do now the government policies concretely hinder or also support these people then with their staying? I don't know who would like to start, maybe.
Well, in Japan, certainly, I think a lot of people have this notion that Japan somehow is closed, right? It's a country that didn't want immigration. Yes, for several decades after the World War II ended, Japan did not have migration, but Japan is also the oldest country. 1 out of 10 people in Japan are 80 and above, and 30% of Japanese population are 65 and above. So you really you really need people there. So I think a lot of the recent development in Japan's migration policy is just to relax the standard, to lower the standard for whatever criteria they had for different kind of skilled categories, and they changed the definition of skill from this education or credential-based definition to more just like a job. If you can do this job, then you're skilled. Right? So it's a specified skilled. And so I think this is a kind of direction that Japan's policy, at least I think in the near future, is moving toward, and also expanding the quota, and the number of people they want to take in. So I think Japan's right now probably is going the opposite direction as Singapore and many other countries who have had a lot of immigration. Japan right now is like, oh, if you don't want to go to Singapore, come to Japan, that kind of situation. So I think policy-wise, Japan is lowering standard, and administratively, they're doing a lot of support. Like they have this particular agency for foreign migrants, and also have a job center. I think this morning, our Korean colleagues here were talking about how difficult the school to labor market transition in the project team. In Japan, I think it's very organized, and you also have hello work for foreigners as well. So a lot of this is support for foreigners as well. So I think, I really see right now Japan is a little bit kind of outlier in the general trend of anti-immigration. I think, but I think Japan's again is a pioneer of a lot of trends, because we are the oldest country. Now or never.
Well, I actually think this does connect with the development in Germany, because German policymakers have also broadened the definition of skill to people who have vocational credentials or even vocational experience, or who are working in fields where labor is needed. But there is this interesting contradiction, because at the same time, and the same policymakers do intensely lobby against immigration, against refugees, against foreigners of the population. And so there is this one discourse that says we want migrants that can integrate and are needed, but then at the same time, this kind of discourse tends to produce a general hostility that just deters exactly those migrants. And so that is really an interesting experience in a country that has started to define itself as an immigration country, that has a lot of popular support for immigration. We do have a lot of immigrants of all kinds and refugees, that at the same time there is this contradiction between making the policy more inclusive and at the same time saying all the time that migrants are not wanted. That is, I think, specifically for highly skilled migrants, a deterring factor, and that is policy related too.
Yeah. That's something I would like to pick up on. So that expectation that either because they're really highly skilled, there shouldn't be a problem, they can just easily integrate, or they would move on anyways. How would skilled migrants respond to that?
The problem is that what we haven't talked about so much yet is the recognition of foreign credentials. And in Germany, that has been improved since 2012. There is a right to have your credentials assessed and recognized. However, the way it's done is an administrative process where an administrator basically looks at what would a German study in Germany for a German profession, and then they look at the foreign education and kind of tick the boxes, which naturally results in the foreign education never being exactly like the German education. And so, basically, a lot of the foreign credentials cannot be recognized for really contingent reasons. For example, German teachers have to have studied 2 subjects, and no teacher in the world studies 2 subjects. So the recognition rate is like close to 0. And that in a country that experiences a real teacher shortage. And so we have this problem too of credential recognition that we haven't touched upon yet.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's something.
And despite there is a law on recognition and there are attempts to recognize, but still it turns out, and that is actually something that we found to be the case in Canada too. You just mentioned that Korea seems to be looking to Germany. Now, when we did our research on Canada about 15 years ago, we were looking to Canada, who had done this turn to immigration country several decades earlier, and everyone thought that Canada was great with their point system, but highly skilled migrants to Canada often found that their credential is not recognized after they have been invited as a high skilled migrant.
The barrier still exists, right?
I think Japan probably hasn't reached that stage that a lot of the sort of real so-called professionally defined professionals are coming to Japan, because I think a credential probably applies to several specific occupations like medical or legal, that sort of things. I think we don't see that kind of people coming in yet. I mean, nurses are coming to Japan, but they have to pass certain kind of, qualification tests, and the passing rate is quite low. So most of the nurses essentially de-skilled to become care workers. And but I think if highly skilled means like for technical skills and IT sort of, or other kind of business, that sort of less credentialized skills, I think Japan is very market oriented. If you can find somebody employing you, you can get a visa. So that's the situation over there. So I think probably in Japan just hasn't reached that stage that it will have so many different kinds of professions coming in. And also it's interestingly that because Japan hasn't had a lot of immigration, I think the kind of anti-immigration sentiment hasn't really reached the kind of degree as we see in Western countries.
So maybe we have to talk about this again in 5 years and see what has happened then.
I hope we'll never reach that.
In South Korea.
I'm curious, Gracia, is there a time period that you can locate where this pro-immigration set of policies sort of accelerated?
Well, it started in basically the whole employment, kind of labor migration regime started in 1989. So basically 1990 was the first year, but then gradually just Japan's migration policy works in the patchwork fashion. Whatever, it's a very pragmatic process. When there's this demand, there's this discourse, there's this negotiation. They have new things to open up this gate, open up that gate, and gradually you have more and more gates opening, and a lot of like thresholds are lowering. It's just because Japan's depopulation demographic crisis is such. It's really a crisis mode.
Maybe that gives us the opportunity then to talk about, we see these challenges, but we also see the needs to keep the people. But what do you see among these highly skilled migrants with their ideas of moving on or of staying? So how do they think about it when they see how open or how close the country is, and how the society maybe thinks of them as just short-term stayers?
I think that, the answer to that really really speaks against the grain of, or the assumption that highly skilled migrants are these footloose cosmopolitans, right? Who can sort of hop from global city to global city, right? Because as what we have been talking about all morning, skilled migrants are constantly strategizing or navigating their lives in relation to these changing rules and regulations, right? In the Singaporean case, as I said earlier, the people who are classified, so skill is very much tied to income in Singapore, right? And the minimum income for qualification into these highly skilled visas is rising very quickly. In fact, I think much quicker in the last 10 years than before. There is a growing variety of visas in Singapore to court not just skilled migrants, but very, very high income migrants, right? So there is a specific visa if you earn $30,000 a month, right? There is another visa if you earn $20 a month, yeah? And I see these changes much more in these high income categories than in the low income categories of migrants. That has remained fairly stable when it comes to the administration of low-income migrants. Aside from, I think, this higher minimum income, another change that has, I think, really thrown a wrench into a lot of highly skilled immigrants' plans is that in the past, their spouses could work, right? If you were on a dependent visa, you didn't have to apply for your own employment visa. You would qualify to join the labor market. That is no longer the case. And if the couple were to have children, these children would not be considered for local schools, and they would have to go to international schools. These are very expensive, right? The fees for these schools are very high. So I think for the main migrant, I think there is a lot of pressure to provide, right? Because now their spouse would have to apply for their own employment pass, and which is in itself becoming more difficult to get. Even though in theory they can get their dependents, aging parents, for example, to join them in Singapore, many are also seeing those applications rejected, right? So in theory, there are these privileges, yeah? But I think the ground is pricklier. Yeah.
It's extremely interesting because we talked about salaries before, and that was what Chang was discussing. And I would like to give you the final word before we move on to questions from the floor on this case of Korea.
Yeah, very similar to Singapore cases. When I interviewed the highly skilled migrants, many said that they love living in Korea because of the safety, cleanliness, convenience, and the cultural attractions. But they also said they are unsure if they can stay permanently. But the main reason for their considering leaving from Korea is low wages, as you said, compared to other countries. Even they are highly skilled migrants, but the companies who need them in Korea are not quite strong, companies. They are all small and medium-sized companies, so they cannot pay much higher. So that is maybe the highly skilled workers, migrants, are not satisfied with that. But the more problem is their spouse cannot work. That's more the issue, so that they cannot live, in Korea. Also, the problem is the concerns about their children's future, because this is the Korean language society. So if Korean language is a globally usable language, they may invest in learning Korean and their children, pushing their children to learn Korean, but they don't know they're gonna stay here permanently, so they may need to leave, right? Then they should bring their children, but their children only knows Korean. That will be problem. So that also actually maybe because of them, the highly skilled migrants are now navigating, considering should we move now, or maybe we should stay more here in Korea. Then and also I mentioned about the difficulties getting the permanent residence. That's also a very important factor.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I would love to hear more, but I think these boxes that we definitely wanted to start at least discussing, that the family matters, the children, the education, it makes the picture so much more complex. But with that, I want to give everyone else also the opportunity to ask questions. So we would open to the floor and also to online questions from the online audience. Please.
Hello, my name is Ruth Achenbach. I'm from the Kwamafa team. Thank you very much for your lively discussion. I have a question that concerns COVID policies, because I believe COVID policies are, in a way, a turning point or maybe a moment of truth for governments to decide who living within its borders truly belongs, and for the migrants themselves also to have a sense of belonging. So by border closures, by deciding who will you let back in, the state defined that, and migrants themselves may have had a dent in their own feelings of belongings. At the same time, some incentives were given out to all people living within the borders. So what did it do in the respective countries that you were studying? Thank you.
Great question.
I think I probably would, start from Japan. I feel that's a very pointed question for Japan. Because, there's a no immigration policy, and this sort of, the old Japan's ethno-nationalism just popped out at the crisis moment. And so Japan closed its border. Only Japanese nationals and the permanent residents could come. And even, they were advised not to leave, even permanent residents, not to leave, so that when they it will be some difficulties, etc. So I think the COVID policy was the kind of juncture that created that sort of barrier. But to be honest, I think that might, that temporarily, kind of turn some people off. But once the dial turned back, we just saw very regular and a sudden influx, because the situation was worse in other places. So oftentimes when we talked about skilled migration, we think of the destination countries. And for those people who have the resources to move around, it's a choice of places. And I used to study this. I found, is your discontent with a place that make you want to move, want to leave? And so for skilled migrants, sometimes it's the discontent with their own home country's treatment of the COVID situation that propelled them to leave the country, and Japan conveniently locates in the vicinity of some of these countries. So we now see a lot of those people. So I think, yes, destination countries thing definitely hurt a lot of people's feelings and turned a lot of people off, but memory of pain is very short term. I don't know. That's just my observation.
Yeah, in Korea, actually, that is really the COVID-19 period shows how the Korean government and society unprepared to be an immigrant society, because the government initially excluded foreign residents from the disaster relief fund. It was only for Korean nationals. That actually made all the immigrants, even who had a sense of belonging in Korean society, made them upset. And then many of the interviewees, I conducted interviews, and many of the interviewees actually felt that time, because of that government action, they were so frustrated, and they felt like we are alien. We thought that we are a member of a Korean society, and that they liked that, but because that period actually made them realize, oh, we are not part of the Korean society. So it's kind of critical and time. I don't know, they still think like that, but after time goes, many memory is maybe fade away, but yeah, it was a very critical time.
Very quickly, actually, Japan at the very beginning also thought not giving this stipend to foreign residents, but immediately they just reversed the course. So actually, when in 2020, when they hand out a lot of stipends, it gives every single person resident in Japan. So even students.
Yeah, later the Korean government also started, provide funds to the permanent residents as well. But the initial act was striking for the foreign immigrants in Korea.
The damage was already done, I guess, right? If no urgent, then I would suggest we move on to get a few more questions. I thought there was one more. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Karen Schönwelder from the Institute here in Göttingen. One or maybe two connected questions. I was wondering, you pretty much deconstructed the category of the highly skilled migrant already at the beginning. So to what extent or in what situations does it make sense at all to do research on such a category that is so weakly defined or flexible? Should we still speak of highly skilled migrants as a separate group? And one image that keeps popping up also in the discussion is this idea of the people who have a choice about where they want to live and where they want to work. I mean, for who is that actually true? I'm just thinking of academia and colleagues in research institutions. I mean, often we do have a biography of working in several countries, but at the same time, it's not true that we have a choice, yeah? I mean, there's visa restrictions, there's the recognition of credentials, there's language barriers, and in Europe, maybe a plumber finds it easier to work in Poland and Britain, in France or so than a teacher, as Anja mentioned. So, I mean, who is that person who has the choice?
Yeah. I think the first point is not to buy into equating political categories with research categories, I think. And when we do research, I think there is this issue of being constructed as desirable, that obviously is important politically because you get a visa. And then I do think that there is an issue of, can your skills connect? Because it does matter whether you have a skill set, for example, in MINT, where connectivity globally is high, versus you have a skill set in more culture-infused or more protectionist areas, such as medicine or teaching. And so I think that's, in sociological terms, that also makes a difference. Like, what is your professional field? I think that's the two most important things that we should look at, in my opinion. And then the term high-skilled is really not ideal because it really, in both cases, describes something that's either politically wanted or that's economically easygoing, easy, correct. In both cases, it's not really related to the quantity of a skill that a person has. My opinion.
Yeah, just two really brief points. Thanks for the question, Karen. I think, firstly, as long as global cities, as long as governments continue to invest in attracting these highly skilled migrants, it tells us that in a different way than they would say low-wage migrants, right? I think that in itself warrants investigation. I also think that by centering so-called highly skilled migrants allows us to think about more broadly about the politics of skill that we've already talked about. And I think I have a smaller point which relates to Ruth's question in terms of the politics of skill, right? I'm thinking about during COVID in Singapore, we were in Singapore, we didn't call it lockdown for most of the population. It was only lockdown when it came to low-wage migrants who were stuck in their dormitories. It was called circuit breaker. And during circuit breaker, one of the things that the government did was to talk about, was to amplify this category called essential labor, right? And essential labor did not refer to academics. A lot of essential labor referred to people who are cleaners, right? Care workers, right? Nurses. Many of these people are also underpaid workers, right? And I think in recognizing that sort of underpayment, under-remuneration with the essentialness of their labor is again part of that politics of skill that I talked about earlier. Yeah.
Yes, I would like to follow up on what Anja just mentioned. And I think it was a great question. So what would be the necessity to even, or what's the use of this label? But because I think a contemporary migration policy is precisely use skill to select people. And skill now replaces race, religion, or nationality as a criterion to label somebody as desirable, somebody as undesirable. In EU mobility zone, there's no such a problem. It's actually what you can do that get you somewhere, right? But in a lot of countries with more restrictive migration regimes, skill is the only criterion that allow people to move. And but then through observing so-called desirable, highly skilled people, we do see the implication of race, religion, culture, gender. So basically, even though skill seems to be colorless, but skill actually is very colored and very gendered. And I think a lot of the kind of team members study about so-called highly skilled, supposed to be mobile people, observe that they constantly reach that sort of barriers of, a culture, religion, and race, and gender. So I think this is a really a very, even though the privileged group, they encounter that kind of situation, the credentialization included. So I think this is still a site we could, use to observe how the privileged could be unprivileged.
Yeah, I also add to that. In Korea, there's a lot of debate in terms of who actually decide who is highly skilled. So who gonna decide and how? So and there is only one indicator agreed on that is income, the wage, because the employers are the best persons who evaluate, the value of their skill or knowledge, so that the employers need that skill. Maybe they pay more, so that the wage could be one of the indicators. But recently, the government brought some other maybe measures or indicators, which is the prestige university ranking, and also the global 500 companies, like in Fortune, so that kind of list is the Ministry of Justice has, and if someone actually is included in that passed, qualified for that standard, government maybe provide the kind of fast track the visa, that kind of things. But so it's very still vague in who gonna define or determine the skill is highly skilled or not. But the wage is still just the only one in Korea. And then universities and the companies are ranking of that. That is a maybe kind of a standard.
Thank you. Let's have a few more questions. One more question, and then after that we have from online. Yeah.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ilivanesa Pacheco. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the Faculty of Law, the University of Göttingen. And we are running a project in the moment which is about the female foreign lawyers. And we have discovered here that there is a gap between the offer that, for example, countries like Germany provides in terms of support for studies abroad. So there are like many people that comes to do the master degree here and then continue with the PhD. But then there is a gap when they're trying to insert into the German labor market, no? Especially in those professions that require specific qualifications or a state exam, right? So my question goes in that direction. Have you explored like any political responses or political programs trying to overcome this gap between the offer in education services for foreigners and then further integration to the local markets in their countries, of course, including Germany as well? Thank you very much.
Online questions afterwards. So let's do a quick round on answers here and then also give the online participants a chance. Okay. If someone wants to.
Yeah, I think a lot of the studies that carried out through this Kwamafa is precisely on this sort of, like a disjuncture between education and the labor market. And I think it's a big issue in the study of skill migration. And I recently also have been studying this, education mobilities, and also there's this term called education migration nexus, right? And see how actually the logic of education and logic of labor market and migration are just very separate. I think there are government policies who want to kind of bridge these, institutional support who want to bridge these, and there are also employers themselves try to lower the kind of threshold to ease the entry. But as Anja, and it's particularly in that sort of legal and a very professional kind of mode, I think there is this institutional gatekeeping. That's that mechanism that's going on, and it's a very separate story from other kinds of occupations or sectors, and yeah, I think it's just a very different stories: legal, medical versus IT or business.
I think what is also an interesting point is that a lot of the administrative institutions are infused with a kind of banal nationalism in the sense of policymakers do not think of the possibility of immigration. And I think I would suspect that this may be the issue in the legal sector, that it's structured around the assumption that people come from Germany. And so whenever someone does not come from Germany, there's subtle differences in their life courses, or they may not have citizenship or something, and then the institutions work less well for them. And that's a very interesting point, because in many sets of policy, it may not even be so gatekeeping and intentional, but there is this kind of institutional neglect for people who come from abroad, and there's really no way to heal this, especially when it's very specific. When it's a big issue, lobbying would be an option. But when it's a small little rule in some professional field, no one even, the people who are excluded may sometimes not even know what's happening. Now legal scholars will, but in other fields, people won't even understand what's the problem. And the policy makers are not even aware of the problem.
Thank you. Shall we? We have some questions from, okay, then let's do 2 or 3 if they're not too long, so that people can decide. Yeah, thank you.
Speak to each other. Ooh. Okay, so there's a question about the fact that recently Germany had several, sorry. Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Recently, Germany had several bilateral agreements to attract international talent. So the question is, what role do these bilateral agreements play in shaping, if any, in shaping highly skilled labor migration flows? Then perhaps this could be combined with another question that asks more generally, if highly skilled migration is a strategy to address some of the issues related to aging, for instance, how can migration policies support economic growth without causing social tensions?
Thank you. Any volunteers? Yes.
Well, I think one important point would be for policymakers to speak out about this fact that if people think that the population shouldn't shrink too quickly, migrants can be one of several options to, address demographic aging. And as long as policymakers don't do this, it's a problem. And as to the bilateral agreements, I think what could also be interesting in relation to the colleagues from Asian countries is that in Germany we are also part of the EU. And for example, the credential recognition is much easier within the EU. And basically, sometimes even credentials are recognized that would not work so well. For example, when you've studied law in Italy, you'll be recognized and be able to practice law in Germany, I think. Contradict me, the lady from the audience. Yeah? But so even though you studied Italian law, and it may not be so easy for you. So actually, Ilka Sommer showed that sometimes trust between countries can be more important than the actual functionality of the title. So, that's also an interesting point. So I think the bilateral agreements create this trust between countries, and that should ease ways for the migrants who want to migrate between those countries.
In Korea, the bilateral agreement is only for the unskilled workers. We have an EPS system, which means Employed Permit System. That is, government has 16 countries within this EPS system. So each country, government made an MOU with that country, sending countries. So, but for the highly skilled migrants, it's quite just a market. It drives supply and demand. So government doesn't interfere of that. Yes.
That's very, very similar to Singapore. We're so similar. It is very much the case in Singapore as well. In Singapore, when it comes to low-wage migrants, we have something called the approved source country model, where it is not so straightforward as we can only get migrants from certain countries to work in so-called low-skilled jobs, but certain countries' migrants are only allowed to work in particular sectors, right? So the reason, for example, that shipyard work and construction work in Singapore, we see an overrepresentation of men from South Asia is because the regulation says that you can only get workers from South Asia for these jobs. But I think the second part of the question, it's also about how do we do this without
social tension?
Yeah, exacerbating social tension. I guess the short answer is I don't know. But I think we need to recognize that two things, right? A, migrants do not take jobs. They fill vacancies. One example is to think of how in the coming years, Singapore will be in critical need of care workers, like nurses, because our population is going to live very, very long. Singapore already has plans to build a city for 100-year-olds. So we will need more nurses. And with our ultra-low birth rate, the answer is immigration, right? So again, that is an example of how migrants fill vacancies. Yeah. The second point, though, is that I think when long-term residents or so-called locals or citizens express dissent or unhappiness, my sense is that they might direct it towards migrants, but I think the deeper, more profound issue that they're reacting against would be these rising costs of living, inflation, growing inequality, right? Yeah.
I can I just...
Yes, for a short
is it okay?
one.
Yeah. I think we have to change the perspective or attitude to deal with the social tension, because social tension, I think we should take it for granted, because as a marriage couple, men and women actually they have a conflict, but so the people who from a different background, if they meet and they live together in the same place, the conflict is natural things, but we should not blame the tension to the immigrants or others. It is naturally taking place things. That's that kind of the way of thinking. That is that we need to have.
Thank you. I would like to give a very short last question to our institute member from the floor. Please keep it short and direct it maybe to one person, because we just have 2 minutes left. Thank you.
I don't know who can answer it, but hi, Vanessa Rau from the institute here. I have two quick questions. One is, thank you so much for mentioning that highly skilled migrants are colored, and I wonder if you had migrants in your samples, migrants with disabilities. And the second question is now from your project now, because you also mentioned contradicting policies in terms of, on the one hand, there are racist policies or racism in society that sort of deters migrants from staying. At the same time, there's a demand for the highly skilled migrants. How do you now, with your results, communicate this to make this public to policymakers, make people aware of those research results?
Yeah. That's a fair point, because we are kind of running out of time. So the question, how to bring that across. I think the one way, the problems that we always see, there will always be this, racist attitudes, there will be a backlash, but in the end what we see, which is very interesting in the Japanese case, is when people are really needed, in the end, even those very hegemonic societal ideas in Japan are kind of starting to break out, just because actually, or to let's say dissolve or fall apart step by step, because people are needed. And with a certain amount of people being there and starting to actually work side by side, as much as there was this idea, no, we cannot actually have foreigners working with us or integrate, actually we see it's working out because it has to be. But that, of course, is something that is taking very long. And I don't think we have, let's say, the policy recommendations at hand. But what we can show is that there is a diversity of people who are actually, who actually find their ways of, who can invest, who have invested in these countries, and who actually, on the ground, can build their lives. And I think just communicating how these processes work, this is basically what we are trying to show, the processes of staying against the problems, but by these, of course, also showing where are still these barriers from the society, from policymakers, that we need to think about in these aging societies, that basically there is no way back. We have talked about that. We have to live with these being immigrant societies. How do we make it work? Small contribution is hopefully our project. With this, let me all thank you very much, again, the 4 panelists for their discussion. And I all wish you all a lovely evening, and thank you very much for coming.